Welcome back to Solitary, Poor, Nasty, British, and Short. This week, Scott sits down with Thomas Douglas, a professor of applied philosophy at the University of Oxford. His work focuses on practical ethics, including the ethics of AI, behavioral influence, neurotechnology, and criminal justice. Enjoy!
Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
My first question is, what's your reading at the moment? What are you reading for pleasure outside of work?
I'm reading a Thomas Mann book at the moment, The Confessions of Felix Krull, which one of my former postdocs bought for me because he thought I'd like it, and I am enjoying it.
What is it about?
It's about a young sort of man from an aristocratic family that's fallen on hard times, and
What, in England?
in Germany.
Germany.
And he kind of turns gradually into a kind of con man who takes over the identity of someone else, I think. But I'm only halfway through it, so I can't tell you exactly where it gets to.
Interesting. What do you like about it?
Good characters. Yeah, I guess that's what I tend to like about books.
Good,
Interesting characters that are kind of a mixture of good and bad.
You discriminate between fiction and nonfiction, or just good character?
Yeah, no, just good
portrayed.
character. Yeah.
And tell me just a little bit about your career. It's not a particularly traditional path to go from being a Kiwi doctor to a Rhodes Scholar to a philosopher, but where did you start in all this? I guess in NZ, you're like 18, and then you sign up for a whole. It's not like med school separate. It's a whole like 6, 7 year, 8 year ordeal, right?
6-year undergraduate degree. Yeah, so I went to med school. I think partly because I was interested in health, but partly because it was kind of
The thing to
do, the hardest thing to get into, and I was a
GC
competitive person, had good grades at school, so I thought, oh, let's do that. But I pretty quickly started to think that I probably was sort of neglecting a part of my brain. In high school, history was my favorite subject, actually, and I really liked writing and arguing, and there's not much writing or arguing in medicine. And also sort of like working out things from first principles, and there was less of that in medicine than I had hoped as well. So I kind of found myself being interested in other things that weren't really the core of the medical training. I mean, I like some aspects of it. I like the patient contact, and I have a good memory, so I didn't find it too difficult to do the kind of rote learning. But yeah, I felt like I was a bit not as stimulated as I'd hoped. And we had quite a lot of medical ethics teaching at medical school and at Otago University where I was. There'd been a big scandal actually in New Zealand in the 70s and 80s, like a gynecologist had basically been running a randomized controlled trial without telling the patients that they were in this trial. That had been a big scandal. There'd been a royal commission, and one of the results was that they were going to have a lot more medical ethics teaching at medical schools. So we had quite a lot of medical ethics, and I kind of found myself being more interested in that than I was in the rest of medicine, whereas most of my classmates were the opposite. So I kind of got more and more interested in that. 2/3 of the way through my medical degree, I sort of had a bit of a crisis and thought, oh, maybe I'm going to just quit medicine and do something else. I just took a year off in the end and did a year of medical ethics and a few other things on the side, some medical law.
Like afterwards or in the middle?
In the mid. So after having done 4 of the 6 years of medical school, then I kind of got the philosophy bug, fell in love with philosophy. Wasn't sure that I was going to do anything in philosophy that was particularly related to medicine, but thought I definitely want to do something to do with philosophy. So I went back and finished my last 2 years of med school because it seemed like it might be a sensible thing to do. And actually, I quite enjoyed it once I knew that I wasn't kind of stuck on that trajectory. But then in the meantime, started applying for scholarships to study philosophy somewhere and ended up getting one to come to Oxford. And
were you too old at that point? I don't know
it was. So I applied for a Rhodes Scholarship in the last year that I was still
allowed.
school.
I aged out by the time I wanted to.
Okay, yeah. So and if I hadn't got it, I think my plan was I would probably work for a year or two as a doctor, and then try again,
Yeah.
get some kind of funding. So I came here. Uh, I basically went back to second year undergraduate. I did a philosophy, politics, and economics degree.
It's like a grown-up with,
as a it's called.
well, not grad. You're 24.
Yeah,
really
24. Like I was in with second year undergrads. Although there were quite a few actually of my classmates who were not that much younger than me, and so I did 2 years of philosophy and economics.
How does that work? Because you had an existing degree.
Yeah, if you've got an existing degree, you sometimes can get an exemption to do.
You just
Called
did a lot.
thesis. You get to skip the first year.
So you did PPE though.
Did
Interesting.
PPE,
Why
yeah.
not
Mostly
philosophy?
Mostly,
I'm
I mean, I mostly did philosophy.
Okay.
I was interested in economics as well. I'd done the other thing that I liked at medical school, the most after medical ethics was health economics, which is quite philosophical.
Yeah.
About how to sort of measure well-being and that kind of thing. So I'd been interested in that as well, and did some economics, especially public economics. But yeah, philosophy was what I liked the most, and yeah, ended up deciding to keep on studying philosophy, and I haven't really stopped.
Any continental or all pretty
All pretty analytic, and I'm not. I mean, I think
You ever
content.
dip in?
I
the
mean,
dark side?
I kind of see why people like it and find it interesting. I'm just not good at it. I'm not good at
Theory.
I'm not good at sort of understanding texts that are kind of not already kind of super crisp and clear. Yeah, reminds me of too much of kind of analyzing literature at high school, which was actually always my weakest subject. So yeah, very much analytic philosophy, and yeah, I've been very much focused in ethics as well. I haven't really worked much in any other area of philosophy.
So for the unacquainted, myself included, to a certain extent, could you talk a little bit about the methodology of analytic moral philosophy? So,
Yeah,
how you proceed from a premise, you use these thought experiments, just for someone who has no experience in this,
yeah. So I guess I would think. I mean, the analytic approach is very much about trying to be as kind of crisp and clear as you can in your thinking. So being very explicit about all the assumptions you're making.
Proof-like.
Yeah, trying sort of, I guess, analytic philosophers are trying to kind of model themselves on mathematicians and logicians in their approach, and so making everything as kind of clear and crisp as possible. So in ethics, a lot of what we do, I would say, is kind of try to make explicit the kind of ethical or evaluative assumptions that people are making, and then once we've made them explicit, we have a sort of range of tools that we can use to try to kind of challenge, I guess, people's ethical assumptions. And one of the tools we use, as you mentioned, is just then as thought experiments. So we will, say, okay, you think that we should only use medical technologies to treat a disease in the patient in front of us, or we should maybe that's maybe that's a good example. So a doctor might say we should only use medical technologies for treating diseases. We should never use it for promoting the interests of third parties, protecting the health of wider society, for example. And then an analytic ethicist will come up with some hypothetical cases, examples, and where it seems kind of intuitively obvious that maybe we should use a medical technology for something that's not just treating a disease, but is benefiting some third party, some offering a vaccine to someone who's not going to benefit from the vaccine themselves, but who might otherwise infect other people, for example. And then the person we're debating with might say, okay, yeah, so maybe I need to qualify my assumption a bit and maybe add in some exception clauses to deal with cases like this. And that's kind of how we can often make progress, by kind of making explicit someone's ethical assumptions and then challenging them in various different ways, possibly using hypothetical examples or thought experiments, and then kind of looking to refine them to get to something that becomes harder to challenge.
Are historical case studies employed, or just the hypothetical ones?
Yeah, some people like to use real life examples, sort of possibly historical, possibly recent. Some people like to use examples from literature. Other people just like to kind of design their own. I tend to want to design my own thought experiments to kind of give more control over the different variables, because when you design a kind of thought experiment, you're often trying to test some particular assumption, and you want the kind of example to not you don't want people's intuitions to be kind of polluted by other factors that are not the thing that you're actually trying to get at.
Yeah, I get the impression in my limited dabbling experience that political theory, history of political thought, that you it tends to use empirical examples from the
Yeah.
past, or from the very recent past. Often, my research, I'm in history, not political theory, but I work on COVID.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very recent history.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas it seems to me like, at least from the talks and such that I've been to, the papers that I've read, there tends to be um, a focus on, in moral philosophy, or in the way Oxford does moral philosophy, on thought experiments, on hypothetical examples. Well, I guess with one
Yeah.
exception of a lot of the AI ethics stuff, that does tend to get empirically rooted.
Yeah, I think that's probably
But
right. Like people in my kind of branch of philosophy would like to use kind of hypothetical examples that they can sort of make as clean as possible.
just to remove the confounding
Yeah,
variables.
and we would be criticized by some people with other approaches for saying, yeah, but that's very, who would say that's very kind of decontextualized, or not. It's not really the kinds of examples that are actually going to come across in real life. And I guess the sort of analytic philosopher response would be, yeah, they're not meant to be kind of realistic examples. They're meant to be examples to test these principles that you're proposing, and then we accept that the real life cases will be much messier. But it's not always the case that people avoid using real life examples. And sometimes I think, if I'm talking to an audience of doctors, I'll probably be more likely to invoke some real examples, just because I know it will be kind of more engaging to that audience as well. So there are kind of reasons why you might prefer to use real life examples. But I think many analytic philosophers would say that, in terms of getting to the correct, or the best justified moral principles, kind of hypothetical examples can often be most useful.
Mm. Mm. What frameworks do you tend to proceed from? Like, I read the most recent book, Protecting Minds. It seems to be, there's a lot of focus on rights and duties. It seems to be sort of in the Kantian deontological tradition. Do you go back and forth?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Utilitarianism, deontology.
I mean, I start.
Who do you draw from?
Yeah, sure.
What are the frameworks
Yeah.
you're using?
So I started out being much more of a consequentialist, working more within a kind of consequentialist tradition, probably not utilitarian. I think that there's a sort of value to fairness that's not captured by utilitarianism.
Sure.
But I would have called myself a consequentialist, someone who thinks that ethics is all about bringing about the best consequences, which would be on the picture. I guess favored some combination of total amount of well-being and kind of fairness in the distribution of that well-being. But when you're working in applied ethics like I do, you generally want to be making arguments that are going to appeal to a range of people with different theoretical commitments, including, in my case, those who were very much not consequentialists, coming from a more Kantian or a deontological, so a more rights-based approach, for example. So I would often I would never be making arguments that kind of assumed that my interlocutor was actually also a consequentialist. So you would try to look for principles that could be accepted by, for example, both a consequentialist and a kind of Kantian deontologist, for example, which is often quite challenging. And I guess by doing that over time, I found myself becoming more deontological myself. So now I think I would probably I tend to avoid kind of
The labels.
strong. I don't have. I think a lot of
You're not at the
fundamental questions are still open in kind of ethical theory, but probably I am not now more attracted to what some would call moderate deontology or maybe constrained consequentialism. So a view on which a lot of ethics is about producing good consequences, but there are some kind of constraints on how we can do that. I tend to think the constraints are usually not absolute, so there are usually, I think we have rights that generally it's not ethically okay to infringe someone's rights to produce slightly better consequences. But I also think that at least for most rights, there are cases where the difference in consequences is so big that it is permissible to infringe someone's rights. But anyway, I found myself in much more of a kind of a rights-based way of thinking about ethics, although I have a weaker understanding of rights than someone coming from a more Kantian background would probably have. I'm also now working on topics that tend to interact a lot with the law, and some of the book I wrote recently on the right against mental interference. Most of the other people working in related areas on what gets called neuro rights are actually legal scholars, human rights scholars.
Who's this postdoc? Forsberg.
Lisa Forsberg, she's
here, right?
She's here. She's sort of trained in both law and philosophy. Lots of the other people involved in this debate. One of the main protagonists in this debate is someone called Christoph Bublitz in Hamburg, who's a legal theorist, really.
Fun name.
So I tend to be, if I was, I'm already unusual when I go to the workshops with these people, that I'm the kind of analytic philosopher in the room, not the lawyer. If I was coming with a consequentialist approach, I would be even more kind of out of line. So yeah. But I've ended up with a kind of rights-based approach.
Why do you think neuro rights is living in law?
It's interesting. I mean,
like I have a friend working on metaethics who's I think he's working with Roger in your faculty, and then I forget who the second advisor is. This is an Israeli guy in law, but his DPhil's in law.
Yeah.
Even though he's working on metaethics.
Yeah. I mean, so I think the neuro rights debate has been. I mean, a lot of the debate has been about how we should interpret certain rights that are there in human rights law, like the right to freedom of thought.
Sure.
There's a right called in European human rights law called the right to mental integrity. Those are both very sort of poorly understood.
What is human rights law?
Sorry?
What is human rights law?
Yeah, I guess it's a branch of law that's trying to capture the kind of fundamental rights that underpin the rest of law. And probably most protagonists in this kind of discussion would think that human rights are both legal rights and moral rights.
Sure.
I personally think we still need to keep them separate. There are the legal rights recognized in human rights law, and then I think there are sort of fundamental moral rights which may or may not map onto them. But yeah, a lot of the discussion's been about in this area has been about how do we understand the right to freedom of thought, the right to mental integrity, and it just happens that neither of those rights has really been a prominent feature of moral philosophy or of ethical thinking
until now.
Until now. So yeah, I've been trying to defend this idea that we have a right against mental interference, sort of analogous to the right that most people would accept that we have against bodily interference.
Rami and Ravi.
We'll get to that.
Yep. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
I just want to say on the methodology for a second. Have you done much work in natural law, or I'm hearing some resonance here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm familiar with some work in natural law. I guess, consistent with what I just said about trying to be neutral between the fundamental theories. Although I'm now generally putting things in terms of rights with my arguments, I'm trying to be neutral about where those rights come from. So I actually
they have to come from somewhere, Tom.
They do. So I personally favor. I'm actually one of the few ethicists that's sympathetic to rule consequentialism. So the idea that we have this set of rights that constrain the pursuit of good consequences, but which rights we have might itself depend on the consequences of accepting. So on a rule consequentialist view, the package of rights that we have,
You can't know the consequences ahead of time. I'm sorry to happen.
yeah, you can't know them, but you can make educated predictions about them. We're not completely at a loss to what the consequences of different endorsing different rights might be, and so my kind of, I guess, current favorite view about the basis of rights would be a rule consequences one, but I don't think any of my arguments that I make in my published work would be kind of committed to that kind of approach. And a natural law theorist could certainly, I think, support some similar rights. So for example, I think it's also plausible to think of this right against mental interference as an aspect of self-ownership, and self-ownership is something that is sometimes endorsed from a kind of natural law point of view.
Okay. Well, I will begin asking some serious questions in a second, but now a fun question. What are like your top 5 rights?
So the rights that I've been thinking about mostly are what I would call the right against bodily interference and the right against mental interference. I guess one of the kind of common themes in lots of my work is thinking about differences between sort of direct ways of intervening on people's body and mind, and sort of more traditional environmental, psychological, social ways of influencing people's bodies and minds. So in the COVID case, I was interested in the kind of comparison between compulsory vaccination and lockdowns as an intervention, and in a criminal justice context, I'm interested in the difference between.
Oh, we're gonna talk.
But I'm just getting to saying that I think the right to freedom of movement and association, which is often the right that's implicated in these kind of more traditional interventions in certain domains, is an interesting contrast, and I'm quite interested in why do we think that the rights against bodily and mental interference are maybe more stronger in some ways than the right to freedom of movement and association. So that's another one I'm interested in. So what are we up to? 3 rights. I'm gonna give you 2 more. Right to freedom of thought, as I mentioned before, I think is an interesting one. How do we understand that? The right in human rights law, there's a right against cruel and unusual punishment, which I haven't thought about a lot, but I think is also kind of has interesting potential implications for some of the cases I'm interested in.
Cruel and unusual punishment would be being made to wear a gown in 30-degree heat in exam halls as you sit all your finals. What about the right to speech? Is that something you've thought about?
I haven't thought about it a lot. I mean, no, as part of my academic work. I mean,
suppose it's right to thought, right to
verbalize
that thought.
Yeah. I mean, I've tended to be, insofar as I'm interested in the right to freedom of thought, I've tended to be interested in,
the nudge ethics, this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so one part of what a lot of, right to freedom of thought is often thought to involve a right against having your thoughts controlled or manipulated, but that's just part of it. And that's the part that I guess I've been most interested in. But yeah, another, I think, plausible part of the right to freedom of thought is a right to sort of being exposed to enough different kinds of views that you have a kind of acceptable range of positions to choose from in your thinking, which I think would have relevance to rights to free speech, but I haven't particularly thought about that in my research so far.
All right, so let's go through the sort of a few of the major projects you've worked on first, and then we'll move into the book. So I've picked 3. So the first major multi-year project, neurointervention in crime prevention.
Yeah.
This is like Minority Report stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the project and what you're interested in specifically.
Yeah.
Or what drew you to this?
So I guess from the beginning I've been interested in ethical issues raised by uses of medical technologies that aren't just treating the disease of the patient in front of you. So non kind of therapeutic uses of medical technologies. I did my PhD on the ethics of enhancement, so using medical technologies to augment the traits of already healthy people.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Like taking steroids or like getting calf implants so you can, or whatever.
yeah, I mean, or
Breast
cognitive
implants.
enhancing drugs, cosmetic interventions are examples. Doping in sport is an example. I started thinking about, what about moral enhancement? So could we,
What's medically induced moral enhancement?
yeah,
Oh, like making a violent person docile?
I was thinking about cases of, things you might voluntarily choose to do yourself. So, imagine a person who like grew up in a kind of racist society. Now they are
You de-racist them with a pill?
well, imagine that you had some medical intervention that could reduce implicit racial bias. Would you, and that you have this maybe quite strong implicit racial bias because of your upbringing, would it be okay for you to take that pill? So that was a case that I started thinking about during my PhD studies, actually as a thought experiment rather than anything that I thought would be kind of realistically employed by anyone. But I started writing about this. People seemed to be very interested in it and started debating my work, and people did start to thinking of it as, is this something that people would actually want to do? Are there cases where we would want to kind of have governments like encouraging this or even requiring it in
But
certain
this
cases?
is hypothetical. I mean, bigotry or whatever it's so there's like a bajillion factors in there, right?
Yeah, there are, but there are.
You can cut one with the red wire and mix it with a blue-green wire and make someone a little less prejudiced.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a super complicated thing, and one of the objections to the idea that we should do this is that it's kind of not really getting at the true causes of it, of course. But suppose we did discover. I mean, there are some drugs that have been found to have had effects on this kind of thing. On
Like
implicit
giving
bias.
everyone Xanax so they're all kumbaya?
Well, I think, I mean, I haven't actually looked at this for a long time, but I know there were some studies suggesting that propranolol, which is a beta blocker, which is also used as a treatment for PTSD. I think because it has memory suppressing effects, and I think that there are some. I think there's some very small scale moral psychological studies that suggest that it can reduce implicit racial bias, probably because of its kind of memory suppressing effects. I mean, I'm not advocating the use of this, but but people did start saying to me, well, do you think people should be moral enhancing themselves? And I was thinking, well, what is a real life context in which we are actually already doing this, or we might
Read Plato, you'll morally enhance yourself.
Sorry.
Read Plato.
Yeah. So I mean, and this is another thing that I've been interested in. Much of my work is comparing kind of traditional ways in which we might try to achieve some goal, morally improving ourselves by reading Plato, with kind of more biotechnological ways in which we might seek to do it, and what are the kind of differences. But anyway, I got to thinking about, well, actually, we do have criminal justice systems that sometimes require people to undergo certain kinds of medical interventions. So there are places where, for example, sex offenders can be required to take sex drive suppressing drugs as a condition of parole.
Really?
There are cases where heroin addicted offenders can be.
What jurisdiction?
So there are several U.S. states and several continental European countries where chemical castration is called, which is taking testosterone blocking drugs to reduce sex drive.
The likelihood of offending.
To reduce, the theory is that it would reduce the risk of offending in sex offenders. Very different ways in which it gets done in different places, but quite a few jurisdictions where
chemical castration.
Yeah.
It just sounds kind of dark.
Yeah, that's part of why I find it interesting, actually, because it's like most people, I have the kind of intuition that there's something very problematic here, but when you start to look at the arguments against it, it's not so obvious what the arguments against it
We don't
are.
want them offending.
Sorry?
We don't want them offending. But rehabilitation is supposed to, in theory, involve rehabilitation, not you're the same guy, but we give you chemical castration.
Well, so
I know there's a whole big argument to be made about. I know you lead the decarceration project, and
Yeah, I
the
mean,
extent to which rehabilitation actually works.
yeah, I think so. The way I would think about what's the strongest argument in favor of using chemical castration? It's not always. There are other drugs like common antidepressants that also tend to suppress sex drive that are also used in this way.
Sure.
What's the argument in favor of using them? It's as as a kind of aid to more traditional forms of rehabilitation. So there are sex offenders who say, look, I really, I don't want to be attracted to children, but I just find, I find it hard to engage in these rehabilitation programs because that's where my desires are at the moment. If there was something that could suppress my sex drive a bit, maybe I could engage more fully with these rehabilitation programs. So you could just see these, and I think there's the case where the sort of argument in favor of these interventions would be strongest is where you're using them as a kind of, enhancer
A voluntary
for rehabilitation.
kind of enhancer.
Yeah. Well, then there's the question of,
Voluntarism.
how voluntary does it have to be? So the way in which chemical castration is used in most jurisdictions where it is used, at least in Europe, is as a
you get out early, but
so a condition of parole. So you might be come out for parole. You're deemed maybe to be too dangerous to be released on parole, sort of untreated, but you may be thought it might be thought that you would be safe enough if you were to undergo some treatment program, which might include pharmacological intervention in addition to psychological interventions. So then the thought is you could offer the individual the option of being released from prison early on parole, but only on the condition that they undergo treatment, which may include chemical castration. So there's some choice involved. It's not as free a choice as we would normally think is required in medical ethics for a medical intervention. But it's also more choice than we would be giving the individual if chemical castration was off the table and we just said, well, without treatment, you're definitely too dangerous to be released, so you're being kept in prison. So there is a kind of freedom or autonomy-based argument in favor of this as a preferable alternative to just keeping people in prison.
And what's the case against? What's the strongest case against?
So the main case that gets made against is just what I said before, that it's out of line with the kind of medical ethics norms about free consent. So we generally have the idea in medicine that you should not be given a medical intervention, but unless it's with your free and informed consent, even if it's an intervention that everyone else thinks would benefit you, it has to be performed. If you're a competent adult, it can only be performed with your free and informed consent. So that's the main arguments out there. But for reasons that I just gave, I think it's not obvious that works in a criminal justice context where we're already heavily constraining people's autonomy, and giving people this choice would actually be enhancing their autonomy. So what is the strongest argument against? I think it's, and this is how I got onto my current topic of the right against mental interference, I think the strongest argument against would be something like, well, we have rights over our minds and our bodies that are stronger or more robust in some way than our rights to freedom of movement and association. So although we think that serious sex offenders, for example, maybe forfeit their right to freedom of movement and association, or some aspect of that right, in a way that makes it permissible to lock them up in prison. And I think anyone who thinks that incarceration is justified has to think something like that. But the view might be we don't forfeit our rights to freedom from bodily and mental interference. That makes something like at least fully mandatory chemical castration unacceptable.
Well, I'm sorry. What's the trade? You're giving up freedom of movement.
So
association. We say it's okay to deprive an individual of freedom of movement and association if what's the condition?
So I think anyone who thinks that incarceration for criminal offenders is justified probably has to think something like that. In committing a serious crime, you forfeit or partially forfeit some of your rights to freedom of movement and association, because we don't think it's permissible to lock up people who haven't committed a serious crime, even if we actually think they're equally dangerous to someone who has, right? So there seems to be something about committing a crime, a serious crime, makes us think it forfeits some of your rights. And that kind of leaves open the door to an argument which says that chemical castration, for example, is not acceptable because we don't, our rights against bodily and mental interference cannot be forfeited so easily as our rights against freedom of movement and association. But then the question is, why would we think that? Are there good reasons to think that these rights against bodily and mental interference are more kind of robust than the right to freedom of movement and association? And I think that's kind of not obvious, actually.
Well, I mean, it begs an interesting question. I'm thinking about the kind of Minority Report logic of, catching criminals before they offend, or finding someone who's likely to offend, and then either and stopping that offense either by maybe you incarcerate them, maybe you disappear them, as certain historical and contemporaneous regimes have done and continue to do. Maybe you give them a non-offender pill. In a thought experiment, like let's say someone, he loves robbing liquor stores. Okay, he can't help himself. And you figure out using your AI algorithm that there's a 99% chance this guy's going to rob some liquor stores. And you put and then you have a pill that inhibits one from liquor store robbery. Is it permissible to force this guy to take the pill before the first liquor store is robbed? Or even after he robs the first liquor store, we don't know if he's going to do it again.
Well, I think there's a crucial difference between those cases. So I think that it would be much harder to justify it in a case where they have never actually committed the crime or a similar crime to the one that they're predicted to commit. And that's because of something like what I said about, I think we do think that people who have shown a willingness to commit certain crimes forfeit some rights. At least I think anyone who sort of thinks anything like present criminal justice systems are justified must think that.
You have to have done it first.
Yeah. So that doesn't mean that we're never justified in sort of restricting people's liberties for
saying they're going to do it or something.
Well, yeah, or just to protect the public in general. So it could be, there are also cases of like pandemic control is another case where it's nothing to do with what the person is going to do in terms of their sort of free actions, but we think that someone poses a risk, and you can imagine that. I think there might be cases where someone has such a dangerous disease and they're so likely to infect someone else that compulsory quarantine could be justified. But it's in a criminal justice context where someone has actually committed a crime, we've got the additional aspect that in committing the crime, the person may have weakened or partially forfeited some of their rights in a way that makes kind of freedom restricting interventions somewhat easier to justify. So I think there's an important difference between those cases.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I also think
first they're totally different. It's a different world where you've done the thing to one where you haven't, but RoboCop says you might.
I also think there's an interesting difference between cases where suppose in one case we've got someone who's predicted to commit some crime. In another case, we've got someone with an infectious disease that's sort of, and let's suppose these individuals are sort of thought to be similarly dangerous. I think we also do have different kind of moral intuitions, a lot of us, about those cases where it sort of seems in some ways more problematic to restrict the liberty of the person who's predicted to commit the crime, because we're talking about their kind of autonomous agency. And I think we have something like the idea that we should treat people as kind of,
we think it's more justified. That's the general feeling.
So I think some people have the intuition, and I have it to some extent, that it's kind of it's harder to justify.
It's harder
to justify limiting someone's liberty on the basis that they're predicted to do some action, commit some crime, say, than it is on the basis of some more natural risk from they've got a virus in their body that might jump out and infect people. And I think it's because I think something like that's kind of treating someone as guilty before they've committed the crime, or it's not kind of trusting them as autonomous agents, and that's just kind of not a factor in their quarantine for infectious disease case. But I think that's actually that's a topic I'm keen to work on in the coming years. Actually, is why do we think those kinds of cases are different from each other? Because I think no one's really given a good account of exactly what the difference is between those two cases, but plausible that there is some kind of difference, and certainly people seem to have different intuitions about them.
Yeah, I covered a lot of this in my research about COVID and content moderation around both non-pharmaceutical interventions and vaccines, but especially around vaccines.
Right.
Um, Particularly at Twitter, or I guess what was then Twitter.
Yeah.
Um, but Facebook, YouTube, Pinterest, they were all sort of doing. Twitter was really the poster child, at least as far as we know, because a lot of
Yeah.
the documents came out in 2022. But I mean, I don't know. This is quite interesting. So I don't mean to belabor this too much, but so let's just say we have example number one. The guy, uh, you know, our algorithm tells us that the guy is very likely he's going to rob the liquor store,
Yeah.
right? And that's thought experiment number one. Thought experiment number two. This guy's posting all over social media. He's telling all his friends. I'm just like fantasizing about robbing some liquor stores. Like I'm a big big lover of liquor store robbery. Like I'm probably gonna rob a liquor store.
Yeah.
Right. But he hasn't yet.
Yeah.
What do we do to prevent this guy from robbing a liquor store without infringing upon his rights and duties? You know, there is at least in my analysis, and please fill in the gaps here with the appropriate analytic philosophy language. There is a material difference between someone who says they're going to do something and someone who's actually done the thing.
Yeah, I think there's a difference there, but I think there's also a difference between the person who says they're going to do the thing and the person who, society deems to be at risk of doing the thing, but has never even said So I think, because you could think that. So there's a question. So I was putting things before in terms of what is it that causes you to forfeit certain rights. Committing the crime itself that it's predicted you will commit seems to be something that might forfeit your right against kind of preventative interventions. But maybe we think that saying that you're going to commit the crime is also something that could forfeit that right. So there's a question about exactly, there's a question about sort of what kinds of actions, besides committing exactly the same crime as you're predicted to be at risk of, might kind of weaken or forfeit your rights against preventative action. And it seems plausible that it doesn't have to. So you don't have to have committed a terrorist attack already in order to have partially forfeited the rights against
I would like to
intervention.
commit.
Yeah, saying that I'm planning, having started to plan a terrorist attack seems to make a difference, and maybe that's enough to make you liable to kind of certain kinds of liberty restricting interventions to prevent that terrorist attack in a way that someone who's just deemed to be dangerous because of their demographic characteristics and who their friends are or something doesn't seem to have made themselves liable to anything. They haven't forfeited any rights. So I think those kinds of cases where people have not committed the crime itself but have done some things that are maybe themselves kind of morally objectionable, or in some weaker way, that might be enough to forfeit some of these rights, or at least it might make a difference to the justification, I think.
So before we move on to the infectious disease
Yeah.
stuff, which is more my
Yeah.
wheelhouse, as far as neurointerventions and crime prevention, like what are examples of ethically permissible, in your analysis, ethically permissible neuro interventions and crime prevention? And I'm curious, first of all, let's just define terms. What do we mean by neuro intervention versus, I suppose, non-neuro intervention? And then what are some, permissible examples of this?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think of a neuro intervention as anything that is kind of aiding your rehabilitation through some direct process, by which I mean not a psychologically mediated process. So direct physical or chemical means. So it could be a drug that
It's not reading a book.
It's not reading a book.
It's
not
plugging a
having
flash drive into
yeah. It's not. It's also not having therapy or something. It's like a drug or brain stimulation or something like that.
quick fix.
Yeah. So. I mean, it might not be a quick fix in the sense
No,
that it
but
might be a
it's-
part of a bigger package of other things.
You're plugging in a wire, taking a pill, putting in a
Yeah,
needle.
yeah. It's not.
It's not a behavioral therapy.
yeah. I mean, the crucial thing I think, on my view, is it's not mediated
It's not
by a
sold.
perception or any other kind of psychological process. So what are the examples? So chemical castration is actually one of the. I think it's an example that is already used, but it's actually
Chemical castration.
yeah. But it's a more controversial one in the sense that it's actually an intervention that has quite a lot of side effects. And obviously is quite intrusive in lots of ways, in the sense that it might prevent sex offending, but it also prevents having any kind of sex life at all, for example. So you could think of, I think, much less problematic cases. So methadone maintenance therapy for people who have committed crimes related to heroin addiction, for example.
What? Say that one more time.
Methadone maintenance therapy.
Methadone maintenance.
So this is like a treatment for heroin addiction, and there are some criminal.
What is that giving people?
So people get a dose.
An allowance.
People get a dose of methadone, which is a kind of long-acting, less addictive form of opioid than heroin, and that suppresses their desire for heroin. So I think that's a neurointervention. It's a direct way of altering someone's desires in a way that's thought to make them less likely to reoffend. That's, I think, actually a less problematic, more plausibly justified kind of neuro intervention in the criminal justice context, because it's less plausible that it's kind of having harmful effects for the individual. There are, as I mentioned, other ways of reducing people's sex drive that are less extreme than chemical castration, like just giving them SSRI antidepressant drugs like Prozac, which tend to have a.
When would Prozac be required?
Sorry?
When would you require someone to take Prozac?
Well, so the case in which I'm thinking it's been used is where it's used in sex offenders, because it tends to have a sex drive lowering effect. So it's not being used for its antidepressant effect. It's being used because it has this effect, which is normally regarded as a side effect, but in this case would be the desired effect. But the least controversial case is probably like dietary supplements. So there are some studies that show that there was a Dutch prison that did an experiment where they put more fish oil in the prison diet food, and
did they ask?
I guess they did. I'm not actually sure about that.
Maybe big fish oil.
Yeah,
deal with the prison.
But they and they measured like levels of aggression within the prison, and they thought
everyone grew gills.
They thought, I don't think so, but I think they did think there were. I mean, it was I think a very early study that. And I'm not sure if it ever got backed up by other studies, but there was an initial study that suggested that fish oil supplementation of prison foods can reduce levels of aggression, and that is actually a neurointervention, in my view, because it's a direct chemical way of altering people's mental desires in this case, and people tend to find that less problematic because it's somehow not thought of as a drug. It's thought of as a food, but it's in my view, that doesn't make a difference. It's still a direct it's still what I would call a neurointervention, and that's another example of a case that you might think could be justified, I think.
Okay, collective responsibility for infectious disease. So you ran this out of the Martin School.
Yeah, well, it's part of a kind of multidisciplinary project in the Oxford Martin School. Yeah.
It looked like you had quite a lot of people involved in it.
Yeah, it was great. We had psychologists, history of medicine people.
Who?
History of medicine. Mark Harrison was the head of the history of medicine part. But there were others.
Any PSI people?
There was a guy called Charles Kirschella who used to be here on history of medicine. He was a
postdoc.
Yeah, I think he was a PhD student. Maybe he was a postdoc at the time. I think.
What's his last name?
Kirschell, or I'm not sure exactly how to say it.
Before my time.
Yeah, it was a while ago. And then there was mathematical biology people. There were people from vaccine group in the medical school.
Anyone from the Pandemic Sciences Institute?
So there were, Andrew Pollard was the head of the vaccine. I'm not sure exactly which group he's in. I think he's in pediatrics, but
Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't.
That was it's an interesting project where we had like really
Multidisciplinary.
multidisciplinary. Had be really the case where I think multidisciplinarity really worked. We had really interesting discussions across disciplinary boundaries.
What did you work on specifically? I know you were one of the top dogs. You were like administering this.
No, I was I think I was called lead researcher. I wasn't one of the people that won the award actually, but I was helping supervise one of the postdocs, and
But what did you work on non-administratively? What did you work on specifically?
yeah, so I was interested in the kind of question of like liberty restrictions for controlling.
This is all those papers with the Swedish woman.
Yeah, so we had well, yeah, so I mean, this was all before the pandemic, but then when the pandemic happened, we we published.
No, this
So
was 2021. I saw papers from.
Yeah, but this project I was involved in ran from 2015 to 2019, so it was actually all
Oh,
before the pandemic came
okay.
along. But then we had lots of the things I'd been working on
cross
we ended up writing things
together after.
based on what we'd been working on that came out during the pandemic. So yeah, I was interested in liberty restrictions. I was interested actually in the comparison between kind of quarantine and criminal justice, with both cases where we restrict people's liberty to protect the general public, and similarly on the kind of bodily intervention side, compulsory vaccination versus for infectious diseases versus compulsory neuro interventions for criminal justice. So there's a kind of parallel actually, I think, between the two areas that I was interested in.
Did you work mainly on non-pharmaceutical interventions like quarantine, or on pharmaceutical interventions? Because I saw papers mostly on pharmaceutical interventions.
I mean, actually, one of the things. The main thing I was actually interested in was
because it's 2019. So
yeah. I mean, but a big thing that I was interested in both before and during COVID was the kind of comparison. So people tend to think that, for example, compulsory vaccination or vaccine passports or something. So it's maybe not completely compulsory, but if you want to do X, you have to be vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
People tended to find those kinds of restrictions more problematic than lockdowns, than just restrictions of freedom of movement and association. And I think it was I think it's debatable that whether that was the right view. Like, I think it's not obvious that lockdowns were plausibly more harmful than compulsory vaccinations would have been for many people. I don't think it's obvious that, as I was saying before, I don't think it's obvious that the right to freedom of movement and association is somehow weaker or less robust than rights against bodily interference that are implicated by vaccination. So I think it was the thing I was interested in is there a good argument for thinking that that we should think that there's a much sort of higher justificatory bar for say vaccine passports than there is for lockdowns, and I think it's not obvious that there was.
Well, let's just take them one by one before we compare them. So for non-pharmaceutical interventions, by which I mean everything, well, not everything, more or less everything except needles in arms, pills in mouths, right? Entry and exit screenings, school and workplace closures, quarantine. This bucket of, non-pharmaceutical interventions to mitigate the negative effects of infectious disease. What is the moral terrain we're treading upon here? So freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech,
and also just like harming people. Like, I mean, I think economically harming people, psychologically harming people by social isolation. So I think there's sort of two aspects to the ethics of it. There's the kind of the rights-based aspect, which is maybe about freedom of movement and association, and then there's just a kind of well-being based aspect, which is just about harming people by separating them from their loved ones and messing up their careers and messing up their education, this kind of thing. So I think there are lots of harms of those kinds of measures. I think.
What about the harms on the other side? A lot of this was done in New Zealand, here in the U.S., all over the place. Jacinda wouldn't let me in. I was in Australia.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, New Zealand was an interesting case because it had obviously a kind of extreme policy when it came to locking down the external borders of the country, but but most of the most of the country had virtually very limited restrictions on freedom of movement within the country. So I think I don't think it's obvious. I don't think it's obvious to say that there were sort of people's freedom of movement and association was more restricted in New Zealand than in other countries. Arguably, it was less restricted in the ways that matter. People in most parts of the country, at least, could freely see their friends and family and loved ones much more than in any other country because of the lockdown on the kind of country's external borders. So I think that's a sort of interesting case of sort of comparing different types of restrictions on freedom of movement and association with each other. Like what's more problematic, forcing people to stay just in their household or forcing people to stay in their country? New Zealand's obviously a special case in the sense that locking down the country's external borders was kind of feasible in a way that it wouldn't be in most continental European countries, for example. But yeah, that's just there's sort of like different types of restrictions on freedom of movement and association, and New Zealand was really strict on one type and less strict on other types.
There's a lot here. I'm trying to say like
Yep.
what direction to go in. Okay. Well, we can talk more about New Zealand if we have time at the end. But I also don't know the New Zealand case as well as the Australian case.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was there. I've studied it. It's also getting hot.
Yeah.
It's getting hot. I feel my brain melting a little bit. And on the vaccine side, like
Yeah.
the individual, the whole like protecting the population at the expense of individual liberty kind of thing. What are the considerations here?
Yeah, so there I think you've got, on the well-being, you've got kind of well-being related things. So it just, is the vaccine safe? Is it going to have side effects for people, kind of thing? And
Yeah.
I would think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that the COVID vaccines that were widely used were safer than lockdown. I mean, they had fewer of the negative well-being effects than lockdown had. So then there's the...
But they weren't available for the first year.
No, of course. But once we had sort of... we're in a position where, to some extent, there was the option between the two. We could have like maybe gone stricter on lockdowns and less strict on vaccinations, or stricter on vaccinations and less strict on lockdowns. Then I think there was a kind of question about, so in public health, there's this idea of, you must be very familiar with, of the least restrictive alternative intervention. And the question I think is interesting here is which is less restrictive? Mandatory vaccination or lockdowns. And you could think of that in a well-being point of view, in which I think it's clear that vaccination was less harmful. Then you could think of it in a kind of rights-based point of view, which is infringing the more important right, or which is the more serious rights infringement. So that's where we get to compare.
Equally bad. I mean,
well, that's where you think about, so some people would say vaccine is worse there because, rights against bodily interference, rights to bodily integrity, sometimes is what sometimes gets referred to, is kind of, in some sense, a stronger or more fundamental right, or more important right than rights to freedom of movement and association. But I think that's not obvious either. But that would be the way in which you could argue for the view that vaccines are a more restrictive option.
But the mandatory bit is the interesting piece for moral philosophy, I suppose. It's not.
Yeah.
Are vaccines bad? Or are vaccines good or bad?
Yeah.
This or that. It's
when can they be?
At what point can they be? Is it ethically justifiable to make a particular vaccine mandatory?
Yeah. And also, I think the sort of vaccine passport case was especially interesting because that's a bit like the...
Well, so it's a little bit separate, actually. It's more of a non-pharmaceutical intervention. You can make vaccination compulsory, right, officially, or you can make it compulsory, as you've said, for certain things, right? So vaccine passport would be like basically an add-on to getting the vaccine.
I mean, I would think of it as like a bit like the case we were talking about with criminal justice earlier, of like, parole on the condition of agreeing to treatment. Like the vaccine passport is like a way of giving people the choice. Do you want to do you want to accept the restrictions on freedom of movement, or do you want to have the biomedical intervention? So I think actually there's a way of seeing vaccine passports as a way of giving individuals the choice between which of these, which thing do you find less restrictive, and allowing people to. I mean, it depends how it's designed, of course, but there's a way in which you could you could effectively give people the choice between, having something injected into their body, uh, or submitting to certain restrictions on free movement and association. And I think there's actually quite a strong case for allowing people to make that choice themselves. Decide which of the things they find more restrictive. Which is
So
some
that's
case,
what was done.
well, in places that went for a kind of vaccine passport approach. I mean, depends what the vaccine passport was required for. But for example, if it was a vaccine passport for traveling, then yeah, that's like saying, do you prefer to be kind of required to stay within your country or within your state or whatever, or do you prefer to have this medical intervention? Yeah, I think there's the vaccine passports we can think of as kind of allowing people to choose between these two different kinds of liberty restriction.
So because of that choice, I mean, at least I didn't read all of them, to be honest.
Yeah.
We're all
Yeah.
impoverished for time. I just, based on the titles, it seemed like you came down on the side of ethical permissibility for vaccine passports. Excuse me, for uh, things in the realm of vaccine passports.
Yeah, I was, yeah, definitely sort of thinking that in principle. I mean, I think there were questions in COVID about whether you really needed to do anything, kind of, how much you needed to do anything in a kind of compulsory way. But supposing, certainly, if you were thinking that we need to do something in terms of restricting people's liberty to stop this pandemic, then I think vaccine passports were probably like,
Least invasive. What's the word?
Yeah, the least restrictive is
Yeah.
the term that often is used. Way to go. So that was generally the kind of view that I was defending, and I guess the other thing I was defending with colleagues was just trying to cast doubt on this assumption that somehow the bodily interventions are more problematic than sort of external restrictions on movement and association in this context. Because I think this standard kind of received wisdom was just
No, yeah, I understand.
the bodily interventions are more problematic.
I think they're both problematic.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they're both problematic too. I think that any restriction of liberty in this context is hard to justify. There needs to be a good case for doing it. But I think I do think that there are certainly hypothetical pandemics in which restrictions of both kinds could potentially be justified, and then it's important to work out which one is the least restrictive.
I mean, there's just so many. It's a subject of my research. So many threads to pull out on COVID. But as long as I'm talking with you, I mean, the thing that is, and just one of the things that I'm just curious to hear your take on is the sort of appraisal or assessment of the logic, which is that there have been past pandemics where younger people were more affected than older people. Like if you look at the 1918 Spanish influenza, older people seem to have a sort of acquired immunity from past exposure. In COVID, it was the case that younger people were just vastly more likely to recover fully, to have much less severe symptoms than older people. And the older you got, the more, exponentially your risk grew, I suppose. And so there was a lot of the pushback amongst younger generations was we are being made to bear the cost of something that doesn't affect us. And the arguments for is, well, I don't even know if it was the greatest good for the greatest number, but it was, it was always at the population level, right?
Yeah.
Now it turns out a lot of the population-wide non-pharmaceutical interventions were known ahead of time or thought ahead of time to be considerably less effective than they were sort of marketed as being in the initial response to COVID. Um, but I guess the question is about you're making a trade-off, right? One portion of the population is disproportionately affected by
Yeah.
something versus another portion of the population who is disproportionately less affected
Yeah.
by that thing. So how do we do policy making?
Yeah.
If we proceed from deontology, we say, no, we can't infringe upon the rights of, I mean, this is
Yeah.
simplifying
Yeah.
things. We
Yeah.
can't infringe upon the rights of the low risk populations um, for the benefit of the high risk populations. The alternative argument would be, no, we can't send the high risk populations to the wolves so that the
Yeah.
low risk populations don't have their rights infringed upon. It's ultimately you could have a right on either side.
Yeah.
It breaks down as difficult, or you could do the utilitarian argument: are there more low risk people or high risk people?
Yeah.
Oh, it's tough.
Yeah, I agree it's tough, and I think their fairness issue was an important aspect of it. So I think it would have been easier to justify restrictions uh, on young people if young people were also uh, more likely to be negatively affected by the virus than they were, because then this fairness aspect would have been less prominent. So I agree, it was there's an extra feature that made it harder to justify these restrictions on young people, that they weren't maybe getting that much benefit directly out of it themselves. It would have been different. You get the same thing in relation to vaccines, in relation to non-pandemic diseases as well. So should we vaccinate school children against flu to protect their grandparents, basically, because their grandparents are the ones that are actually potentially going to die of flu? That tends not to be discussed as much or as controversial, but I think there's a kind of similar uh, issue there. Except that, in that case, you might think, well, the flu vaccination probably benefits the children as well, just to a lower degree. But, imagine that the flu vaccination had more side effects than it did, then there'd be this kind of fairness kind of issue as well. So I think that is an important consideration, and that was an interesting feature of COVID. It did make it kind of harder to justify the kind of restrictive interventions on low risk groups.
And yet they were justified, I suppose. And
Yeah, I mean
sometimes
that way. Yeah, I mean, I think there were interesting
I'm
questions.
not. I'm not saying they were morally justified. They were verbally justified anyway.
Yeah, that where people took them to be justified, and justifications were given. I think it is an open question whether there should have been a bit more selectivity in terms of, like, you know, having looser restrictions on lower risk groups like younger people, rather than just sort of imposing the same restrictions on everyone. I mean, I guess you could argue that we did kind of, like in the UK, during some of the lockdowns, um, babies were still able to go to nurseries. Children were allowed to go to schools in certain cases if their parents had important jobs for the pandemic. So I mean, I think you could argue that the case of children, there were kind of lesser restrictions than on other people. And I think, yeah, it's an interesting question whether that should have been the case more generally.
Are you familiar with the October 4th, 2020 episode, the Great Barrington Declaration? There was an Oxford professor.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I can't remember the details. So what was remind me?
Details were exactly what you're just describing. It was a 900-word
Yeah,
document produced by an Oxford professor of theoretical epidemiology, Sunetra Gupta, a Harvard professor of public health economics, Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Kulldorff, who was at Harvard. An argument, they basically advanced an argument for what they called focus protection, which was an argument against population, high stringency, population-wide non-pharmaceutical interventions in favor of sort of individual protection strategies.
yeah.
High-risk populations should take the measures
Yeah,
to protect themselves, and low-risk populations
Yeah.
should immediately be allowed to
Yeah.
resume normal life, business as usual. It was a very reasonable declaration in my reading of it. It had co-signatories from all over the world, but the backlash it produced was swift, enormous. I mean, we have to think about the timing here, right? Boris and Trump both initially sort of moved on COVID in March. Schools ended a few months. Well, people because we're sent home, but the school year ended. You go through the summer. There's questions about what we're going to do in the fall, and then in the fall, and then there's also a context of this being right before
Yeah.
uh, the U.S. presidential election
Yeah.
of 2020. There was this declaration, but it basically was arguing for um, low-risk populations resume business as usual voluntarily,
Yeah.
and high-risk populations voluntarily take whatever measures you see are best. But the authors were, tarred and feathered. They were degraded in the American Academy and the UK Academy. A lot of this, not all of it, but a lot of it played out on social media. In some cases, people lost their jobs. Um, uh, and it sort of just became a flashpoint, or
Yeah.
it became an episode that I analyzed in my
Yeah.
thesis.
If I recall correctly, there was sort of, I mean, because I think that the question about more targeted and less targeted restrictions also obviously depends a lot on the.
Well, it wasn't about restrictions at all. It was about voluntary
Right.
individual behavior.
Yeah. But I guess.
Oh yeah, it was about removing compulsory, mandatory restrictions, population-wide restrictions.
But I guess there's an important kind of empirical question about how effective would that more targeted or more voluntary approach have been. And my recollection is that this controversy was largely about the kind of empirical predictions of this group, right? That a lot of people thought they were very optimistic about how going to this more voluntary approach wouldn't drastically increase the number of COVID deaths. I don't know. I don't know if that's it's not my area of expertise, the empirics of it, but seems like. So I think in general there'd be a case in favor of more targeted restrictions. But if there were going to be 10 or 100 times as many deaths with more targeted restrictions, then obviously there's a trade-off to be made there. So the empirical predictions are kind of crucial as well.
Well, we know after the fact that's not what happened, but notwithstanding that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, like, but
Let's not look for the. I'm not
Yeah.
asking for the sake of the ex post facto
Yeah.
vindication of
Yeah.
the authors, or the ex post facto vilification
Yeah.
of the authors for having wrongly
Yeah.
predicted.
Yeah.
Turns out they did not wrongly predict, but that's not what I'm asking you.
Yeah.
As you said, that's not your area. I'll get someone from Blavatnik in here if we talk about the data.
Yeah.
What I want to talk to you about is on this subject is the utilitarian calculus of which you kind of just described, of saying, look, we could do this if we keep the restrictions in place. The number of cases and the number of excess deaths will be lower. If we remove the restrictions, the number of cases and the number of deaths will be higher.
Yeah.
From a purely utilitarian calculus, it's a pretty easy decision to make. But as you said, you don't.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
don't
I
like
don't think.
utilitarianism?
I don't think it's a purely utilitarian calculus. But I'm also not an absolutist about rights. So I mean, I do think there's some level of some amount of harm at which we have to say, okay, we can do this thing that infringes people's rights. We should actually compensate them for it if we can, because we are infringing their rights. But it's justified, all things considered, because the cost is just too high.
How do you compensate a teenager for having lost years of school?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, but I think we should when
Attempt?
if we're infringing people's rights because we think that there's overriding justification for doing so, then we should try to compensate people for that. And we probably can't fully compensate for that, but there's an obligation there, I think. So someone who's a more absolutist about rights than me might say, well, no, it's never justified to
Infringe upon
the rights. I mean, they might think, typically, a common view would be that, you can only. There is a kind of interesting. If there's some super low risk, super low cost thing that you can do to protect other people,
My friend Dominic was talking about this.
Right, and
I didn't agree with him.
I mean, so I think no, but I'm maybe putting it in a more rights-based approach here. But people, so for example, one thing that some rights theorists will say is, well, if there's some low-risk thing you can do to protect other people, you have an obligation to do it. If you don't do it, then maybe you forfeited some rights against intervention. So that's a way in which even someone who's a kind of absolutist about rights could say that in cases where there's some really low cost thing you could do that would be hugely beneficial, if you don't do it, then the state can be justified in enforcing it, even for an absolutist about rights. Anyway, I'm not an absolutist, and I think that sometimes we are just justified in infringing people's rights because the costs of not doing so are so big. And, but yeah, others would be more absolutist than me.
Okay, so let's just I'm mindful of time here. Not that mindful because the battery in my watch died, so I actually don't know. Well, actually, what time is it now?
You just I got here one though, so it's 500.
Okay, great. Well, let me just ask the last sort of set of questions. Is that
Yep,
good for you? So part of my research now, not my dissertation research, it's for another project, is about disinformation, a particular kind of disinformation called active measures, which was is quite common during the Cold War. The Soviets, by their own terminology, referred to a kind of deception operations, active measures, where they would attempt to exacerbate contradictions within the nation, within the polis of an adversary, by using a mixture of fact and fiction. So often it would be like 80% fact, 20% fiction, or 90% fact, 10% fiction, or sometimes it would be all fact, right?
Yeah.
What you want to do is play upon pre-existing grievances, play upon pre-existing rifts, and sow discord.
Yeah.
Within the adversary. So a lot of times, what this looked like was, backing both sides of a particular conflict, or just trying to
Yeah.
stir things up,
Yeah.
right? So I know you work on digital ethics. I know you work on mental integrity, raw me.
Yeah.
This plays out in a few different ways. So on the one hand, we are constantly being influenced by advertisers to buy the
Yeah.
right color of lipstick and this and that. And, we might say, well, that's okay. And you introduce, insensitivity to process, which I want to talk about. But on the other hand, really good propaganda or disinformation campaigns, when executed well, what they succeed in doing is getting people to change their beliefs without knowing that they've changed them, or executing this in a way that is independent of reason,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe let's get into another question. Maybe you rationalize ex post facto, but the coup, the great coup, is for someone to not have known that you were there at all.
Yeah.
Right? They change maybe it's to support a particular candidate or to turn against another candidate or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So talk to me about insensitivity to process and how we think about the ethics of influence.
Yeah. So the background question here, I think, is which ways of influencing other people's beliefs or other mental states are kind of okay, and which ways aren't okay. Giving people moral arguments seems to be okay. Stimulating their brains without their consent seems to be not okay. What about
That's
all the
what
cases
you do when
between?
you scroll. I mean, right?
Yeah, so I think so. So I think there are two. So I've defended this idea of mental interference, where a mental interference is a way of, as I understand it, is influencing people's beliefs or other mental states via processes that are not sensitive to reasons. So giving them a drug or stimulating their brain would be an example, but so
That's not okay.
not okay. I mean, infringes their right to do this to someone without their consent. But it's not just the kind of the drugs and the neurotechnologies in this category. It's also things like subliminal imagery. I think lots of kind of conditioning kind of based interventions, like putting loot boxes in computer games that make them more addictive, would be another.
What? Well,
Loot boxes is like when you game designers randomize the rewards you get for passing like a level on a game or for opening some box in the game. They randomize the rewards you get rather than giving you a consistent reward, because they know that makes it more habit forming. We find it more kind of addictive to keep playing the game in that kind of case.
Doesn't sound good.
So that's I think that's another example, I think, of a kind of influence that affects someone's mental states in a way that's not it's not working by giving them reasons that they're
But they've
recognizing. It's just
I don't mean to interrupt
yeah,
you.
it's good.
I am interrupting
Yeah.
you. I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
But I apologize for my rudeness here. I'm thinking you volunteer to play a video game.
Yeah.
You could argue you do volunteer to buy a pack of cigarettes and then they're addictive, or to watch porn, or to drink alcohol, or to take we'll just call it addiction pill. You volunteer, at least on the first pill, in theory, to take it. Now, of course, there's cases you to take the morphine in the hospital, and then or the opioids in the hospital, and then you.
Yeah, so then there's a question about whether people can consent to this. So I think people have this right against these mental interferences. I think that you can waive that right through consenting to something. So I think of consent as a way of waiving certain rights. So you can waive your right against, having your appendix removed by consenting to the surgeon removing your appendix. You can waive your right against against mental interference in relation to some particular.
By agreeing to the terms and conditions.
Yeah. Now, well, then the question becomes, was this really sufficiently informed consent? Did people really did the little kid who downloaded the app onto his iPad really have the information and the cognitive capacity to consent to?
No.
Yeah,
of course.
So I think in theory it's possible to consent to mental interferences, but I think it's very doubtful in lots of cases in the online world that people are really consenting. So that's one issue. But anyways, we've got this mental interference. There's one kind of problematic case. One kind of mental interference that's in the not okay category. I think there's another category which is not actually really my focus, but I think is interesting, and there's some very good recent work on it, which is manipulation. So I think of manipulation as something different to mental interference. It's not about influencing people's mental states via processes that are insensitive to reason. Manipulation is about, the way I understand it, and this is borrowing a theory that's been developed by someone called Robert Noggle. Noggle has a view that manipulation is like intentionally inducing some kind of mistake in the other person. So deception is the sort of clearest example. Getting someone to have a false belief by misleading them in some way. But he thinks there are other kinds of mistakes, like you can get people to have a desire that's stronger than it should be because the thing that the person desires is not actually desirable, or you can get people to kind of weigh reasons incorrectly or make some other kinds of. He thinks there are various kinds of mental errors. So what you were talking about at the beginning about misinformation, or kind of what was the word you used? Active measures. That struck me as a clear case of kind of manipulation. That's these people are trying to get people to have either false beliefs, or to be confused about something that they really shouldn't be confused about, or like
not necessarily. Well, we don't have to dwell too much on active measures. Active measures is about exacerbating pre-existing contradictions or rifts. So you like a lot of Black Lives Matter groups in the U.S. were the sort of they were being like a lot of social media accounts for BLM accounts for like just dudes sitting around a room in Russia, or bots or trolls or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So when people show up at a protest in New York, they have like well, it depends what you mean by it. They are voluntarily showing up. Nobody's forcing them to show up, and they do probably, if they're showing up to the protest, believe in the cause, right?
Yeah.
But they were manipulated in order to get there.
Yeah. I mean, I think, most of those kinds of interventions, there's some kind of like false belief that, or mistake of some kind that the intervening
The belief isn't false. Someone else.
Well, maybe not the
nudge.
Yeah, but
they pushed you in a direction you were already going.
Yeah. Okay, but maybe.
I'm not defending this.
Yeah. No. I mean, I think lots of cases of manipulation maybe don't work by. You can be manipulated into believing something that's true, right? And the way I would think about that is someone's getting you to hold some belief that's true, but they're getting you to hold it via getting you to have some various other mistaken beliefs or other kinds of mental mistakes. Like, they're getting you to, for example, someone could try and get you to manipulate you to believe something by giving you the false impression that everyone believes this, and right. So the thing that they're getting you to believe might be true, but they're getting you to believe it partly by having a mistaken belief about how popular this kind of belief is. That would be a kind of classic example of manipulation. And I think most of the kinds of things that get discussed under the heading of misinformation are working like this. They're either trying to produce a kind of false belief in the end, or they're trying to produce a belief via producing some other kind of false belief or mental mistake of some kind. So I think this Nogel's theory of manipulation is a really useful theory for thinking about these kinds of cases. But anyway, that's another category, I think, of mental influence that's in the not okay category, that we probably have some kind of right against it.
Right against being
right against mental
mistake
interference.
making.
We have right against being deceived and manipulated.
Do you have a right against being deceived? And don't you also maybe have a responsibility to assess information?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think those two things are incompatible. I also think there are cases where we waive that right. So
I could be deceived into thinking it's not going to be hot out because there's clouds out. But I didn't. I could be, I mean, it's not a good.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, you can be. Okay, so so I'm thinking of manipulation and deception as something that some other agent does to you, right? So, but there are cases where we speak of being deceived or manipulated by the way. It looks like there's a thunderstorm brewing on the horizon, but actually,
You're saying one person actively exercises.
One person intentionally produces. In the case of manipulation, I think it's something like someone intentionally gets you to make a mistake of some kind for some other purpose, and I think that they're getting them to make a mistake that generally makes it morally problematic, and this is kind of non-absolute right against that. So yeah, that's the way I would want to think about it. But I do think there are cases where we consent to being manipulated. There are some people think that the early phases of a romantic relationship are like this. We actually maybe when you're dating someone, I don't know. I've got a student who's working on this, and I think it's an interesting question. I think it's at least arguable that people are kind of knowing that both parties in a kind of dating context are like putting their best foot forward, and they're not necessarily giving a completely accurate portrayal of every aspect of their personality. And you could argue
CV padding.
You could argue that that's a kind of thing that everyone knows is going on, and everyone is kind of tacitly agreeing to it. But there's still limits, of course, on how much you can deceive people in this context. But
I mean, we wear clothes, we wear makeup. Are we deceiving others as to what we?
Would that be deception? I'm not sure if we'd call it deception, because we're not intentionally getting people to have sort of like mistaken beliefs. We're just not
We could say wearing makeup.
revealing certain information. But
makeup is
makeup
altering.
Yeah.
I'm not advocating against makeup.
I think that's an interesting case. So yeah, so the student I have is working on
or like your shoes like accentuate your calves or something. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's there seem to be these cases that we don't find particularly problematic, but then there are other cases. So the student I have that's working on this is actually working on the case of, is it called chatfishing or catfishing or something, where people on dating apps
catfishing
are
you pretend to be
I get an AI, I get
19-year-old whatever bikini model.
Yeah, or I just get AI to like write all my messages to the person I'm trying to chat with on a dating app.
Oh, is that happening now?
To be much more like
dark,
charming than I actually am. So that seems to be a case of deception that is crossing the line in this context. But there are other kinds of deception that we seem to accept in this context, is all I'm saying. So like, I think we have some like a right against being deceived and manipulated, but we can also waive it in certain cases.
Yeah, I have a friend tell me we're gonna get to the point where it'll be like my AI will talk to your AI, and we'll see if we're compatible. I know you don't work on this in particular, but you work around it. And you think we should break up the big tech companies, go William Howard Taft, do some trust busting? If this is like, Rami, or it's being everyone's infringing upon, all the big tech companies are infringing upon all of this, right? We are all being manipulated in ways that probably are not in our best interest. We are vectors of data.
Yeah,
it's a mutual agreement. We voluntarily give up. We do sign the thing. We know it's bad. It's in the discourse that it's bad.
Yeah.
But how many people do you know who are really off it completely?
Yeah.
I don't use it much, but I still dip in occasionally.
Yeah.
this is going to go up on YouTube.
Yep.
I don't spend much time on YouTube myself, but
Yeah.
it's so,
Yeah.
you know, you want to get lectures, they're on YouTube, you want to get, and then they're promote on the side components.
Yeah.
Anyway, do we break up the big tech companies?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely think it's a problem that we are being manipulated and probably mentally interfered with by these tech companies, and certainly they have a huge amount of power to do it, even more than they are. So I think that is a problem. I'm not enough of a kind of economist to know whether breaking up the tech companies is the best way to reduce that power, but it does seem like a plausible.
Is the power the problem, or the problem that they're doing it? I have the power to punch you.
I
but
think
I'm
both.
not doing.
I think both are a problem. I think it's the worst thing is when they're doing it, but I think it's even if they weren't doing it, the fact that they had the power to do it would be a problem.
I don't know. I have the power again to attack anyone in this room.
Yeah, I mean,
What do you mean by power? Ability, like.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm thinking of this view in political philosophy, freedom as non-domination, it gets called, where the idea that part of the being sort of subject to arbitrary power is problematic, even if it's not being kind of used against you. So that's meant to be, for example, one reason why democracy is better than dictatorships is that the power in a democracy is less arbitrary, and you have some influence over yourself or something. So, and I guess I think there's, at least intuitively, I think there's something to the idea that it's problematic for people to sort of hold arbitrary power over you, even if you're not using it. But I agree with what you said before, that the main.
You hold arbitrary power over your postdocs or your graduate students.
Yeah, maybe that's not great. Yeah, I mean,
well,
yeah.
but at some point the doctor needs to train the internist, whatever, like there's always going to be a power structure, right?
I guess so, but I guess
There's
I'm really like power is not something I've worked on a lot, and I haven't thought about this, but I guess I would think that maybe like power asymmetries kind of, they require justification or some sort.
There's a difference also between power, hierarchy, and domination. These are all different categories, right? Like I think the principle you were talking about of non-domination is one thing, and having a hierarchy where a surgeon with 20 years is more of a say on how we're going to do the surgery than a first-year med student.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Another.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. Yeah, I definitely think there are lots of justified kind of power asymmetries. Do I think that power asymmetries are always kind of in some way bad and require a justification? Maybe, I don't know. But I also think there clearly are cases where there's sort of such strong power asymmetries that there is a problem that would need quite a strong justification. And I guess I would think that the kind of power that the big tech companies have over us now would probably be in that category. I mean,
what about nation states?
Yeah,
some nation states are economically, militarily stronger than others.
So I don't know if like.
But of course, that could be justified.
I mean, certainly the
that,
states have power over their citizens, and I think that requires justification as
states also have power to a certain extent over each other.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting issue in political philosophy. I guess I'm always inclined to think that the kind of individual people are the kind of the ultimate kind of right bearers in ethics. So the question is really always about power over individuals. So it's a complicated question when you're thinking about power of states over each other. But I guess I think it's a problem that Donald Trump has a lot of power over me, and I didn't elect him. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.